Ah, vale. No, jo no puc... Ah, sí. El Niro, no? Sí, sí, sí. Sí, sí, perfecte, molt bé.
Welcome everybody. Thank you for today. Jordi Bascompte, who is with a talk of the most cited ecologist in watcher when he was a teenager. To the PhD thesis. Did a PhD in biology at the University of Barcelona. Most of you will recognize the animal of animal behavior. Really from the start, the career of Jordi was Irvine, and then to the Center for different topics in ecology, including ecological disturbance. The position at the IFISC, at the Spanish National Research Council. Switzerland to Zurich, where he is now professor at the University of Zurich. In dataset analysis, trovates fundamenten a license is really that people really just I read a list of the journals, Hour of the Ecological Society of America. And the National Spanish Research Hour in Environmental. He's now a member of the board of the ecosystem. Stop here. Just something that he works is interested in, or is the keyword network appearing many times of this.
a nice introduction also for the invitation. Coming to several of you in meetings, so it's really nice. To summarize the work that my colleagues that's been mentioned before. So hundreds of species in a museum, while biodiversity which is not encapsulated by this picture. The fruit of a palm tree. Mechanism in originating biodiversity. Less emphasis was done in understanding of the fruit and the plant diversity, and this is not that is famous on the origin of species, that was entirely devoted Darwin understood as nobody before that we can on research on this coevolutionary interaction almost all this research was for as you can see here in the picture. Because Darwin was aware of the power of evolution to knowing that this has been the most important mechanism into the number of species of flowers was together with my good friend Pedro Jordano in Doñana and the idea at the time scientific community, and that's the idea of information to understand a pattern of Each one of the orange nodes corresponds to represents a real community. Out of an incredible amount of hours observing to learn everything about that particular community, do physicists. We biologists are very well trained that was our idea, and therefore we started building at which some of our colleagues open repository, Web of Life, and all this data of ecological networks. Then these are the networks are organized. And with that, the architecture of these networks, this structure for our understanding of how perturbations, and finally summary of what I mean by describing field and trying to use them in our field with the whole we're going to be representing those networks in column will correspond to a plant species generalist plant species. So as and so on. So the way these are that's a very particular way of packing those can be packed. For example, in a modular structure, random across the islands of an archipelago coming from of our mutualistic networks, in this case be quantified, is an index because it depends very much on how big the network is. Very short, that context comes from null. Out of chance, we get a pattern so that it's a network that is significantly this size and fit. But this the average for seed dispersal, the average for between pollination and seed dispersal, see just the entire data set. In the previous slide, and networks which have a clear organ communities at the entire level. This is a property about the way these pairwise interactions are organized, because that's describe that pattern. Next, and I'll be starting by looking at the implication coming from the field is static. We have a snapshot of it's the analytical analysis of through time, and that depends on three factors. That encapsulates competition for and finally, there's this positive component that the number of my mutualistic partners are in the as simple as this. Of the very basic mechanisms through time. So again, this is the sort of models that have been used in community ecology probably since the pioneering paper by Bob May in 1972. But what people were doing so far was trying to use a mean field approach. So they were trying to come up with very simple analytical results, but by making strong simplifications. For example, what a mean field approach means in that context, it would mean assuming that pretty much all plants are equivalent. But of course, this is not what we want to do, because we are starting from the observation that these networks are very heterogeneous, and that the number of interactions of one species may be very, very different than that figure for another species. Therefore, here we join forces with a group of theoretical physicists led by Ugo Bastola, and the idea was still being able to write down simple analytical results. And this is an example of this kind of results. What this equation is meaning is, or is telling us, is what's the level of competition between these two plant species, I and J. And you can forget about the several terms in here, but I would just like you to focus on what we have here. This is the number of interactions of plant I, the number of interactions of plant J, and this is the shared number of interactions between two I and J. Now, if you remember, this is exactly the definition of a nested matrix. Again, by using this cartoon, you'll see the point here. Let's imagine again that we have these two plant species, I and J, yellow and orange. And the idea of a nested matrix is the one where we maximize the number of shared interactions. Orange plant has two interactions, and these are contained in the set of three interactions by the other plant species. In a nested matrix, this is maximized because there's a negative term that reduces the competition these two plant species do. This is only for two plant, but we can generalize for any two plant species. And essentially, that would be the average effective interspecific competition between 20 plant species in that community. And this is a function of a single value, which is the leading eigenvalue of that matrix. Immediately, we have here a bridge, an analytical link between a property of the matrix, that is to say, a property of the way these interactions are organized, and some meaningful concept in ecology, which is competition. That's one of the keywords in ecology, right? So by working a little bit more with the algebra, we can end up writing down an equation that is giving us the increasing number of plant species, how many additional plant species can be supported in relation to the baseline without mutualism, and that depends on this average competition effect, which in turn is a function of the architecture of the network. So other things being equal, the take-home message would be that the higher nestedness, the lower interspecific competition, and the higher the number of species that can coexist. That's a mathematical result for which I have to confess I had little intuition, and it took me several weeks to really understand. So in here, with the cartoon, we can go back to the cartoon to give an intuition for that result. And the idea is as follows. These two plant species have a negative interaction, the red one, described explicitly through the beta term in the previous equation. This is the competition, the explicit competition for light, nutrient, sunlight. But they have also some indirect interaction, an interaction mediated through the network of interactions, which sign and strength very much depends on the balance between two opposite forces. On one hand, these two plants are also going to compete for pollinators. After all, pollinators is another shared resource. But there's also a facilitative term, in the sense that, for example, if a plant is very abundant, a pollinator of that plant will also become abundant, and if now this pollinator pollinates a second plant, the second plant may benefit from the success of the first one. And what I like you to focus is that these sort of ideas only make sense, are only defined when you have a network. It's impossible to see this kind of indirect effects. They are not even defined if we only work with pairs of species, one plant and one animal. Therefore, what this means is that mathematically one can be proved, other things being equal. Of course, there are some assumptions in the model, as always, that a nested pattern, again, the pattern that we see again and again in nature, in these networks of mutual dependence, is the one that maximizes facilitation over competition. And therefore, that's the reason by which this supports a higher number of species. That's the reason for which we coined the expression of the architecture of biodiversity, because it's important in understanding how many species can be supported to see the fire brain by which these species are interconnected. So far though, this is an analytical result, and you could wonder to what degree this sort of relationship makes sense in the context of the natural range of variability on those properties. To address this question, here what we're plotting is each dot corresponds from a real community, its value of nestedness, the observed range of nestedness from our communities, and I'm plotting the prediction of the model, the previous equation, parameterized with that particular network. That is to say, those analytical predictions are fit to a community with that specific number of plants, that specific number of animals, and with that specific interaction between each animal and each plant. So what this shows is that the increase in biodiversity predicted by our theoretical approach increases through nestedness. Again, you could say, well, that's a correlation, but it could be that what's really driving that relation is another property that covariates with nestedness. For example, the size of the community or the connectivity or whatever. That's actually a very good point to try to go down to the problem. What we are plotting here, it's the same amount, the increase in biodiversity predicted for that particular network versus the same value for a randomization of the network. So now I'm taking each network, for that particular structure I plug it into the analytical expressions and give me a prediction for how many species can be supported. I randomize the network, which again is a way to shuffle the interactions but leaving everything else equal. So we have the same number of plants, we have the same number of animals, we have the same number of interactions. The only we change is who you interact with, and do the same. And if points were among the line, that would indicate that network structure doesn't matter. The increase in number of species is the same. But as you can see, almost all networks, or at least all the networks that are represented by a solid symbol, which means again that are significantly nested, have an increase in biodiversity higher than the equivalent for a randomization. So this seems to suggest, of course, there are lots of issues here, and this is not the perfect approach. Randomizations themselves are like a war, and there's people who make entire careers out of these null models, right? But it's a reasonable approximation to see this particular way networks are structured as the one that explains this increase in biodiversity. So far though, these networks are structured in a particular way, and this way seems to be of relevance when understanding species coexistence, one of the all-time classic problems in ecology. I'm going to be moving now to the second implication of network structure that has to do with, given a network, regardless of how small or how big it is, giving a network, how robust is going to be in front of a perturbation. And to do that, I think it's relevant. Now I'm going to make a little bit of a detour because I think it's relevant. Sometimes it's not only the kind of problems we are working with, but also the way we try to answer these problems. And I think that one of the interesting, or at least I found relevant characteristics of our lab is that you cannot dissociate the problem from the way you try to address the problem. Has to do with what I'm going to explain you right now. So in theoretical ecology, since again the pioneer work by Bob May, almost all work has gone through the direction of linear stability. And here I don't have to emphasize that much because you all know much better than I do what this means. But essentially what you do is to take a model, choose a specific range of parameter values, calculate for that range of parameter values a solution, and then you see whether the solution is going to be linearly stable or not, meaning whether this solution will come back, will recover after an infinitesimally small perturbation. Essentially, that would be an unstable one, because if you push, no matter how small you push, the ball is going to bounce around and end up in another solution of the landscape. That would be stable, because after pushing a little bit the ball, it will end up to the same place, and so on. To some extent, although there's been great work done with that approach, on the other hand, this has constrained very much the way we think about these questions of stability. So a little bit using an analogy by the late ecologist Ramon Margalef, working for 40 years only about linear stability, at the end it's like imagining entire communities dancing on the tip of a pin. So rather than doing that, which is, again, for a given set of parameter values, whether a solution is linearly stable or not, we thought that it's much more relevant, especially in the context of global change, which implies big perturbations and directional perturbations, trying to use other currencies for stability. And the one we've been using in the last few years is the one known as structural stability. The idea now would be to see for a given, what's the range of parameter values compatible with a solution, in this case, state A. So we're measuring that amount here. Notice the difference. We are not just picking up a set of parameter values and then deciding whether that solution is stable or not. What we are doing now is trying to infer how big is the range of parameter values compatible with that particular solution, which means, how big is the range of perturbations that the system can withstand remaining in the same state. And a state would be the one in which all species persist. This goes back to a long tradition in math, a long tradition in other fields on the concept of structural stability, starting from most likely Lévi-Strauss in France, in social anthropology, linguistics. The idea has been exactly the same. René Thom and his catastrophes theory. And in ecology, this has been pretty much, has gone pretty much unnoticed, although in other fields in biology has got a very nice and long-lasting influence. And one example, I'm going to give you an example, is in developmental biology. Per Albert, the famous developmental biologist that passed away a few years ago, would say that we are very much trapped into the selectionist program, which is to say, trying to understand why a structure is there in terms of a function, right? So everybody, or almost in all textbooks, you'll see similar figures like this one, emphasizing the wonderful diversity of these structures. How natural selection changed the shape of that structure so that it optimized the ability of a mammal to fly, a bat, the ability of the same sort of animal to swim, a whale, to run, to go through the trees, and things like that. Although that's certainly interesting, for Per Albert, that would miss the really important question. And the really important questions by Per Albert, but also George Oster and Stephen Jay Gould, would be why the structure of a tetrapod's limb hasn't changed in so many years. Of course it has changed, but these are all details. But the basic pattern has remained the same. For Per Albert, that would be the idea. And Per Albert would understand evolution as the modification of a conserved developmental program. And Per Albert would say that we have a space and there's a nonlinear mapping between genotype and phenotype. That is to say, that imagine that we have a combination for that arbitrary axis and this one, and we have here a population. Even if situations change, like the population genetics, natural selection, or drift pushes populations around here, as long as we are in that domain, it's going to map to the very same phenotype. Only if, when we cross these boundaries, suddenly there's going to be a major shift and we'll find a different phenotype. So then for Per Albert, the answer to the $1 million question would be, we see that structure for so many years because it's the one compatible with a wider range of developmental conditions. That's the idea of structural stability. Now, again, we are doing nothing but borrowing this important concept. We're just transforming this landscape, actually as a homage to Per Albert, one of the three sciences that have the highest influence. We were using the same picture. We published this 2 years ago in Science, and actually that figure is exactly cut and paste from Per Albert's original work. The idea is exactly the same, trying to see whether different network structures have a different range, in a different volume in parameter space, and therefore a different ability to withstand perturbations. The idea is that we can see again the nested network, a random one organized in compartments, and trying to see whether each one of those is compatible with a different domain in parameter space. That's exactly the idea. We're now moving into the concept of structural stability as the framework, the one we choose to expand these ideas about robustness, resilience in the face of global change. And we've been doing that. So I present here the result for a network. I'm going to walk you through that scheme. Essentially here we're looking through models of networks. That's a theoretical result, right? We're having a gradient of nestedness for a hypothetical network and a gradient for another parameter of structure, which is not relevant now. But the idea is that through that gradient we have a different color. The reddish the color is means that for that particular topology of the network we have a higher structural robustness, which means a higher volume in conditions compatible with the stable coexistence of all the species. Therefore, this shows already that yes, theoretically there's a link between network structure and this measure of resilience, structural stability. The question now is where the real network lays in that graph. And to answer that question, it would be around here, around the reddish part, which seems to suggest that the real network is located in the position that maximizes structural stability. Of course, again, this is for a network, and we want to see how general that result is, otherwise we could just picking up the nicest example, right? Here I just simplify, just for visualization purposes, results for these 12 networks, and in the majority of cases, not always the case, but in the majority, large majority of cases, we always find the real network within that area in parameter space that maximize or is compatible with a large structural stability. Therefore, it's not only that this nested structure that we've reported in the field in real mutualistic networks helps to support a higher number of species, but it also seems to make those networks more resistant in terms of fluctuations. However, what I've been doing up to here is trying to see what's the range of perturbations these communities can support without losing one or more species. It's interesting on itself, but most likely through the long-lasting effects of global change, in many communities we are far beyond that point. We've crossed already that point. We've had already a few or multiple extinctions. We cannot put an exact figure, but most likely we've passed that point. Therefore, it's also interesting to see once you cross that point, what's going to be the rate and shape of the collapse of these networks. And to do that, I just briefly show you a picture that represents a collaboration and ongoing work through a graduate student, Jelle Leber, co-supervised by myself and Martin Scheffer, who has been making very influential contributions in our understanding of tipping points, our understanding of systems where essentially you push them and nothing seems to be happening until we cross one of these tipping points. And both through topological simulations where we remove nodes, through more dynamical approaches where we, for example, in this case, for a dynamical model, as the one I've showed you before, we are increasing a driver of pollinator decline. This could be an increase in temperature, an increase in habitat fragmentation, of pollutant, it doesn't matter. But it's a variable, it's a surrogate for a worsening in the conditions for these pollinations, right? For these pollinators. And what we are plotting here is the way these communities decay. And as you can see, it's a highly nonlinear process. At the beginning, they decay in a slow way, but suddenly there's a threshold where the rate of decay is much higher. Well, the idea now is that we now understand how the rate at which these species decay, but obviously when I talk to biologists, they would say, well, yeah, but this is strong simplification. And they are totally right. Species are not the same. It's not so relevant knowing that 20 or 15 or 15 species will go extinct, but which species are those? Are those similar? Are those different? And that difference is important when understanding the functioning of these communities, when understanding that different species may have different roles. Therefore, here we are laying another, or adding another layer of information. Again, we start with one of those mutualistic networks, but now we'll be using name tags. We'll be recording who is who in that community. One way to do that is by overimposing the phylogenies of the plants and the phylogenies of the animals. And this is work led by a former postdoc of mine, Enrico Rezende, who had been trained in these statistical tools which are known as the comparative method. And essentially are tools that try to correct correlations between trends. For example, to what degree the size of the brain correlates with the size of the body, correct those comparisons through phylogeny, which is a way to control for the non-independence of all these points in a regression plot, for example. So the idea is to put these phylogenies and then see whether two species which are close in the phylogeny, such as these two species here, are also close in terms of the role in the network. For example, whether they interact with the same number of partners, whether they interact with the same subset of partners. And a result summarizing that piece of research comes here. This is just each symbol is a community. Here we separate the analysis for plants in green and animals in orange. And what we are plotting here is the correlation between phylogenetic distance, how close in the phylogeny are two plant species, and ecological distance. Two plants, again, are ecologically similar if they tend to be pollinated by the same subset of pollinators. It's just a comparison. For the ones more interested in the methodology, this is a mantle test, nothing more than that. So you have two matrices, distance in phylogeny, another matrix, distance in ecology, and you correlate those. So solid symbols, pretty much half of those communities, 1 out of 2 of those communities, have a significant correlation. What this means is that to understand this pattern of interactions, it's important to understand past evolutionary history conveyed in the topology of these networks. Phylogeny matters in those communities. That's of relevance on itself because it helps us to understand the combination of mechanisms that can lead to these networks, but in particular, for what I'm interested right now, it's important when going back to those simulations of network collapse. And the reason is as follows. Imagine again that we are performing a simulation. We start from a real network. In this case, it's a topological one, as many other people have been doing in the context of other complex networks. You remove one node, another node, and you see the point at which the network collapses, the population point, right? So the idea is, imagine that we reach that point, that a cascade of coextinctions take place, and imagine that 10 species disappear. Those 10 species represented by the dots here could be randomly distributed across the phylogeny. In this case, bad as it is because we are losing 10 species, it's not so bad from the point of view of evolutionary history, from the point of view of the functioning of the ecosystem, because, for example, perhaps it's not that relevant losing that species because we have a sister species, because they share almost all their evolutionary history. They are going to be doing similar things. From the point of view of past evolutionary history, the loss is going to be very small. It's like pruning the leaves of a very rich evolutionary tree. But because of that phylogenetic history, that's not the case. Because a phylogenetic signal, it means that species that depend on the same resources are the ones also close in the phylogeny. That's by definition. Which means that we are not going to be in that situation, rather we'll be in a situation that it's closer to the cartoon. Of course, these are cartoons, right? Represented here. While now, the species are clustered around a branch of the phylogeny. It's not only that we'll be losing the same number of species, but now we maybe lose entire branches of the evolutionary tree. And that's a much more important loss from the point of view of this pool of evolutionary history, and also because most likely none other species will perform the role, the functioning that those species were doing. Therefore, the take-home message would be that, okay, this network of interaction seems to make those communities larger and more robust, but because of that interaction between phylogenetic structure and network structure, the rate at which species collapse implies a faster loss of evolutionary history. Good. Let me wrap up a little bit my talk. I'll be stopping here. And I tend to do it in my talks with that picture or a similar one. And I think it's a nice way to start a talk, to end a talk that start with that picture of the number of insects in a museum. And I think that represents or encapsulates very well the take-home message of my talk. And this is a piece of work by Alexander Calder. It doesn't, it's not important that you've never seen that particular one. If you are acquainted with Calder, immediately you'll recognize this as one of his mobiles, right? Because all those have sort of a style. So in the same way that everybody would agree that there's more here than just a collection of nodes, because it's the way these nodes are interconnected that gives that particular style to Calder, we have to embrace the notion that there's more to biodiversity than just a collection of species. Those species also interact with others in a particular style. It's a style that we see over and over again. And what we've learned in the last few years is that understanding that style is important if we want to be better positioned to understand how these communities, not one species or a couple of species, but those communities as a whole and the services they provide will collapse as a consequence of global change. And already, as you said in my introduction, that's really a collaborative work. As you can see here, what we try to do, sometimes more successful, sometimes less successfully, but what we are trying to do is to combine efforts, because we really think that it's only through the combination of different approximations that you can know better about these systems that are quite complicated, and therefore that has to be through a program of research that involves joining forces with people who lead techniques that you are not so familiar with. So I want to end up acknowledging Pedro and Jens, with whom again I started working on this project 15 years ago. Everybody, past and current graduate students and postdocs in my lab, and other colleagues around the world. It's an extraordinary group of people, and it's been a pleasure for me to work with them and to learn from them. And I think I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Jordi. So, questions and comments?
It's a technical one, actually. In the beginning, one of the slides you showed this equation with two terms, the competition, mutualism, and the growth.
Yes.
And I noticed that the term of mutualism had a different functional dependence than the other one. In particular, it had something in the denominator. Can you
yes.
Why is that different?
Yes. Okay. Let's say the reason for that equation was it started with a reaction that our paper in Science 2006 had. So in Science we published this paper that we tried, was my best attempt to understand the dynamics of these networks using a very simple linear model, and proud as I was about that, because I was able to do a little bit of algebra myself. The thing is that we are assuming linear responses, and some people were very critical about it. So essentially, that what this term encapsulates is the best that we knew at the time of the biology of those interactions in the context that you cannot grow linearly as you have more resources, because there's a point at which you saturate, and then each represents a saturation term. There are different ways to model that. If some of you are familiar with that, those would be like Holling type 2, for example, type functional response, Holling type 3. These are just little variations of a common point, but the important thing is this saturation. That represents the saturation.
Why is different in the mutualism and in the competition is not there?
Well, here because we try to keep things as simple as possible.
You should include that also in the...
Yeah, definitely. You can do this as complex as you want, but in here there's a little bit of, well, always there's a trade-off between realism and simplicity. But in here there's another trade-off. So what we really want to do is to show the importance of these mutualistic networks in the context of our current theories in biodiversity. Therefore, what we try to do is to add that component in terms of our conceptual frameworks for competition, for example. That's easier in this case than if you come up with a completely new set of rules. Then it's going to be much more difficult to assess the relative role of mutualism in relation to what you would expect through computation. Of course, there's a lot of simplifications. For example, competition assumes mean field, lots of things, but you know, here there's a little bit of a trade-off.
Well,
I have one question. I'm new in the study of ecological networks. I came here for a sabbatical with an abstract.
Oh, it's she's in Barcelona now, no?
Yes, yes.
She told me.
I've been always wondering why not to study antagonistic interactions. They are also very important, and they are also important drivers of biodiversity, because fungal pathogens and plants and stuff like that. It's very nice, but I think it will be also important to look at other dualistic and antagonistic interactions.
Absolutely. All right, I'll give you two answers. The first is the honest answer, and the other is the more politically correct answer. The honest answer is just because the people we bumped up into Sevilla were people who have been working in mutualistic interaction for a long time. The three of us really believe that mutualisms are really important, and just because we had read a lot about competition. So I think one should see at this from the other perspective. I mean, mutualism was missing. There was no theory. There was a little bit of theory of mutualism, mainly the evolution of mutualism, but based on pairwise. We had a community context for understanding predation, top-down predation, and things like that, competition, but we didn't have the equivalent for mutualism. So the first answer would be just to fill that gap, just out of necessity, because these were the data we had at the time and our expertise. The second answer, a little bit more elaborate, is that you have a very valid point. Those mutualistic interactions are not isolated from other interactions, and indeed that's a direction that several groups are taking now to merging interaction types. But I think you have to first crawl before walking, no, as they say. And I think it would have been too complicated to just build models where you have competition, predation, and mutualism, because at the end you would see some patterns different to the ones predicted by your theories, but it would be very difficult to understand what's the reason for that difference. I think it's been, I honestly think it's been a good strategy, because we've learned lots of things about the role of mutualism, but you are totally right that now it's the time to study networks with different types of interactions. We start doing some steps in that direction, a paper by a former student of mine, Carlos Millán in Oikos, and now Sonia Kefi and a few other people are trying to understand networks combining different interaction types. So it's a good point.
And you mentioned that your networks are a fixed snapshot, and you acknowledge the concern about this, let's say, limitation that I also share. I was thinking about when you take this fixed snapshot, some of the species could be, let's say, invasive species, just replacing the native species, or some species like the taxon cycle that are able to expand their niche in very simplified communities like those in small islands. So how sensitive is this, or are we to incorporate some, let's say, the temporal dynamics of each of the nodes in the final result, incorporating all the ecological processes that could be also functioning in a very simplified network. I'm saying so because the resilience of the ecosystems is quite a key result of this. So you assume that just an extinction of one of the nodes will imply, let's say, an instability of the network. And it wouldn't be necessarily like this. If some of the species are able to replace this role in the network, or
yeah, totally. No, I think that's a really valid point. I totally share it. The short answer is that we know little about it. We know little, but there are directions that try to go across those lines. I mean, for example, not by ourselves, but other groups are trying to look at the position of invasive species, for example, like Monserida, or Memot in UK, things like that. There's been people developing extensions of our models that account for trophic flexibility, the fact that, okay, if a species disappears, you can adapt to consume other resources, which we know it happens. We don't know the extent, but we know it happens, for example. But ultimately, your question has to be addressed doing experimental work. And this is where we are now. But this is extremely difficult. So I start an experimental approach associated to my advanced grant, but the advanced grant in theory has expired. I asked for an extension, and we are still in the very, very, very preliminary stage of the preamble of the experiment itself, which I think encapsulates the fact that it's very difficult. Now in my new home institution in Zurich, I'm benefiting from the wide range of interest and expertise, and we are trying to approach that from a different perspective, from a different system. So there are a few discussions going on how to use, for example, bacteria and virus to look at these sort of dynamical questions. That's a very good point. Hopefully, at some point, we are able to. But I think you identify like the limit of these studies. We have to move into dynamics, and that means we have to move into doing some experimental work. In Doñana, we continue. So with Jason, that's my partner in that experiment, because obviously he's the one who has the experience. The ultimate goal of this monitoring of networks across these gradients of complexity in the landscape in Doñana, we're going to be use those as batteries of networks that are going to be in experimental cages, and then we'll be deleting species and doing things that can give you an idea about how the biology of the system and the dynamics can affect this kind of very preliminary results. But it's obviously very difficult.
More questions? I have one myself. You have shown a plot of the decline of pollinators as a function of some driver.
Right.
The trend is at the decay, but there is something. There are many other things going on. So there are.
Yes, small details.
Well, small details looks.
No, what happens is that oftentimes when you are totally right. Oftentimes when a species disappears or a species goes down really fast, others benefit because the competition is reduced. Things like that. There's a little bit of effects like this one, facilitation. Some species go up again.
You have a comment or question? If not, let's thank you, Jordi. I take the opportunity to remind you that this afternoon at 7,